So to finish that up, the decomposers replenish the amount of inorganic nutrients in the soil that can then be utilized by producers through the process of decomposition. So this is a general scheme of chemical cycling from our textbook. So chemicals, they cycle in the ecosystem, and they involve both the biotic and abiotic components. So the overall term that's used is biogeochemical cycles. Bio for the living biotic organisms, and geochemical because of the geologic processes and atmospheric processes that are dealing with the cycling of these chemicals. So in the scheme here, step one here is the nutrient uptake by producers and incorporation into the biological molecules from the abiotic environment. Then consumption by consumers, so there's a transfer of molecules and chemicals into consumers. 3 is waste production by producers and consumers that then release chemicals back into the abiotic reservoir, which is step 4. Also, action of decomposers that are then also liberating and releasing those substances into the abiotic reservoir. And then there's just the basic geologic processes, often weathering, that make these chemicals available to producers. So let's focus on the carbon cycle and how it cycles through the world. So carbon is a major ingredient of organic molecules. Remember, organic molecules are carbon-based molecules. And carbon, it has both an atmospheric reservoir, think of CO2, and cycles globally because it's readily available in the atmosphere. So other abiotic reservoirs of carbon include fossil fuels and dissolved carbon compounds in the oceans, which isn't shown in this figure. So the cycling of carbon between the biotic and the abiotic worlds is accomplished mainly by photosynthesis. Notice carbon enters into the biotic realm via photosynthesis by the photosynthetic organisms, transfers through primary consumers by consumption, the herbivores, transfers to secondary consumers, predators, by consumption of the herbivores, and then and that's the processes of cellular respiration that's occurring in those organisms. And then, before we get to that, cellular respiration releases carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. When these organisms die and decompose, the detritus, and also from leaf litter, is broken down by decomposers, and that gets released, that carbon gets released in the atmosphere. So the other component that we see here is the burning of wood and fossil fuels by humans. It's actually adding more atmospheric carbon in the form of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, causing things like global climate change. And that's a fairly recent phenomenon, only in the last few hundred years, but it's significant. So a little video here on the carbon cycle. Get the volume up. And here we go.
Could a carbon atom that was once part of Albert Einstein be in you? All living things need to take in carbon-containing molecules to fuel their activity and build their cells. This is true for busy students and for all organisms. Let's look at how carbon atoms move through the carbon cycle in the Arctic tundra. Carbon atoms from carbon dioxide are incorporated into living things by producers, such as this plant. Carbon dioxide enters a leaf, moves into a cell, and goes into a chloroplast. There, in the process of photosynthesis, carbon dioxide is used to make sugar molecules. The sugars can be used to build larger carbon-containing molecules, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. In this way, carbon that was in the air is now part of the plant. When a plant is eaten by an herbivore, or primary consumer, carbon in plant tissue enters the primary consumer's digestive system. There, plant molecules are broken down. These small molecules are then used by the primary consumer to make larger molecules for building its own tissues. In this way, some of the carbon that was in a plant becomes carbon in a primary consumer. Similarly, when a primary consumer is eaten by a higher-level consumer, some of the carbon in the primary consumer is incorporated into the higher-level consumer. Carbon-containing molecules in dead plant material, animal feces, and dead organisms are taken up by decomposers, such as fungi and bacteria. Decomposers break down these materials and incorporate some of the carbon atoms into their own bodies. We have now seen how carbon moves from carbon dioxide to producers, to primary consumers, to higher-level consumers, and to decomposers. How does carbon get back to the atmosphere? During cellular respiration, carbon-containing molecules are broken down, and ATP is made. Carbon dioxide is released as a byproduct and returned to the atmosphere by producers, consumers, and decomposers. Overall, this return of carbon dioxide by cellular respiration is closely balanced by its removal from the atmosphere through photosynthesis. The global carbon cycle involves living things on land and in rivers, lakes, and oceans. And, by the way, considering the huge number of carbon atoms in each person and how quickly carbon atoms move through the carbon cycle, there is almost certainly a little of Einstein in each of us.
So that's a nice little video there on the carbon cycle. Let's move on to the phosphorus cycle. So organisms require phosphorus, P, as an ingredient for the nucleic acids, phospholipids, ATP, there's the P for phosphate, and for production of bones and teeth in vertebrate organisms. So phosphorus cycle does not have an atmospheric component. It's terrestrial and aquatic only. So the rocks are really the only source of phosphorus for terrestrial ecosystems, and it's made available via weathering and erosion. And then phosphorus is limited in some terrestrial ecosystems. So the phosphates in rocks are broken down in soil, incorporated into plants. So the phosphorus then enters into the biotic realm there. Plants are consumed by animals. So there's the transfer of phosphorus into higher level consumers. The detritus and decomposition of these organisms by the decomposers then releases phosphorus back into the environment, and so forth. In the aquatic realm, phosphorus runoff into the water makes it available for organisms there to incorporate. And then when phosphates get into rock through sedimentary action, those are released back into the environment through uplifting of rock, mountains, and then through weathering process, back available now for incorporation into the biotic realm. So a bit different than the carbon cycle. Let's move to the nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen is an ingredient of proteins and nucleic acids, so it's essential as well. It has two abiotic reservoirs. It's available in the atmosphere as nitrogen gas and also in the soil in the form of nitrogen-containing molecules. So the atmospheric reservoir is nitrogen gas, N2. Plants cannot use nitrogen immediately or directly. Plants can incorporate carbon through carbon fixation that occurs through photosynthesis. But plants rely on bacteria that can do nitrogen fixation. So what happens is bacteria associated with plant roots or just simply bacteria in the soil can utilize atmospheric nitrogen, and through their actions, the bacteria, called nitrogen-fixing bacteria, excuse me, can convert inorganic nitrogen into an organic form of nitrogen that is then able to be incorporated by plants. And then once it's in the biotic realm, it can be transferred into the subsequent consumers. So then you have nitrogen in the biotic realm. And then, of course, the living things die. Detritus and the decomposers that break down the dead things and detritus then release nitrogen back into the soil, where it can be utilized by uptake through organisms through photosynthesis. And then there's a type of bacteria that can liberate the nitrogen that's in the soil back up into the atmosphere, called denitrifying bacteria. So it cycles through the living and non-living realm through these processes. The overall nitrogen cycle. Okay, let's move to how humans affect some of the cycles. So human activities disrupt the naturally occurring nitrogen cycle by adding organic nitrogen, an extra N here, by adding organic nitrogen to the biosphere in massive amounts each year, more so than natural processes do. So humans have altered the environment by adding more nitrogen than the natural processes of the planet do. And that's pretty amazing to consider. So two major sources of nitrogen, organic nitrogen, actually just nitrogen, are the combustion of fossil fuels, adding nitrogen into the atmosphere, and modern agricultural practices, in particular, adding nitrogen-containing fertilizers into farms and fields to supplement the nutrients required by plants to grow. If you do gardening, you do a similar thing by adding fertilizer, and part of that component that you're adding is nitrogen-containing molecules to help plants grow faster and healthier. So some nitrogen will escape into the atmosphere, where it can form nitrous oxide, and it's a gas that contributes to global warming. So another thing that humans can do that's harmful to the environment. In terms of nitrogen pollution in the terrestrial and aquatic realm, nitrogen pollution occurs when human activities add excess amounts of phosphorus and nitrogen to aquatic ecosystems. It's usually through agricultural runoff. So these sources of phosphorus pollution include agricultural fertilizers and runoff of animal wastes from livestock feedlots that get into streams, creeks, rivers, eventually into the water, larger water bodies of water like lakes and rivers, and eventually out into the ocean. Also the outflow of sewage treatment facilities that release their water into streams and rivers, usually. So phosphorus pollution of lakes and rivers results in heavy growth of algae and cyanobacteria because they're getting these nutrients and allowing them to grow rapidly. What can happen then is, as these blooms of algae and cyanobacteria occur, as they die and decompose, the bacteria that use them, that decompose them, absorb much of the oxygen in the water and actually deplete oxygen that's then not available to larger organisms like amphibians and fish. It can cause large amounts of die-off and actually dead zones in some of these places. So a major source of nitrogen pollution are the large amounts of inorganic nitrogen fertilizers. Actually, that should be organic nitrogen fertilizers that are applied to crops and lawns and golf courses to make everything pretty and green. The excess can get into the water column, streams, lakes, and rivers, and eventually work its way out into the ocean, as this figure depicts. So nitrogen runoff from Midwestern farms linked to an annual summer dead